let's start by introducing ourselves. Margaret Harvie is my name. I am an IAP2 trainer, but I have only, unlike these guys, been a trainer for the last 12 or so years. And I live in Sydney, Australia. And I'll hand to Lewis next.
Hi there, Joni from San Diego, California, where I've resided most of my life. And Marty Rozelle, who we are honored to have as our interviewee today, is somebody I've known for a very, very long time and just very excited that we're going to be interviewing her today.
Great. Well, I'm Marty Rozelle. I'm delighted to be with you today. And I am coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, the United States. I began practicing this discipline of public involvement more than 50 years ago, which maybe not quite, but it's been a very long time, and was one of the founders of IAP2 and also the training program.
My first question, which is really, I guess, how you found yourself involved in engagement. Why, how did you get here?
Yes. Because it's definitely not something you get a college degree in, certainly not in 1978 when I began. Well, my journey was after college, got a job with the federal government, then decided I liked working at the city level. Then I came out to Arizona and got a job with the city of Scottsdale. I really liked being the level of government that was closest to the people. And ultimately, I went off to grad school and received a phone call a couple of months after I finished my coursework and my oral exams, had not done the dissertation. But I got this phone call from a man who was with an international engineering firm, and he had gotten my name from someone else. And would I be interested in being written into a proposal that was to look at alternatives to a big dam here in the Central Arizona area? I had no idea what he was talking about because I didn't even know what the RFP meant, for example. But I was so ready to do something other than beat my head against the wall trying to finish my grad program. I said yes. We ultimately got the job, and Jim Creighton, who was the founder of IAP2, and he really is the founder of the practice, was part of our team. And he was the strategist and the overall leader for something called public involvement. And my job was to be a public involvement specialist. Again, I didn't know exactly what that meant, but we got the job and we got started. And that was in 1979.
Fantastic. So tell us now about, I guess, when you started to sort of put some structure and some thinking as part of the IAP2 material. What was happening at that time? I mean, what sort of inspired that? What sort of conversations were you having with people in the workplace or?
Well, yes. In this project was a very big project. It had 2 federal agencies leading this whole effort. And because they were very forward thinking, as was our firm, and we had Jim Creighton, we had the opportunity to be very creative with how we involved the public in this big, controversial, huge project decision. One of the things that we did on that project, I created, and I called it the public values assessment. You had socioeconomic assessments, you had environmental impact assessments. Well, this was the public values assessment. And that process was such that people realized they agreed on way more than they ever thought they did. And I ultimately did get my dissertation topic off of that project.
So Marty, that brings up a question for me, because values, public values as an engineering principle at the time was probably not well thought of. So was there something about your background or that you brought to this that would make you think of doing something as radical as making engineers do a public values assessment?
Well, probably. I think I came at it from a little I definitely came at it from a different perspective. And I learned an awful lot through the first year and a half of this project, because with Jim's leadership and the flexibility of these two federal agencies, we were doing really interesting workshops and coming up with alternatives. But when I wanted to, quote unquote, sell this idea to our own team, I had to use a word that was familiar to them. And so I selected the word criteria. And I said, I kept pushing them to come up with a list of criteria that they were going to be using to, first of all, develop alternatives, then ultimately to evaluate the alternatives. And I wanted them to I wanted them to define them in a certain way. And I learned this when I came up with this technique. I wanted them to define them so that a particular criteria, which later I called values, criteria would be depending on, it could, what is the range? When you define it, I wanted them to define from the best to the worst, because then we were evaluating our alternatives, and it was a way to begin to help people do some kind of a rating, not ranking, but rating or weighting of the importance of these criteria.
Now, were these technical criteria at the time?
They were probably a little more, for example, they weren't engineering, because we said, okay, first of all, it's got to be engineering. You got to be able to build the dam from an engineering standpoint. But they were more probably social impact on Indian relocation, flood control, endangered species, river recreation, cost and benefits was a big one. Those were some of them, archaeological, cultural resources. So they were more your range of environmental factors, because it had to be a given that engineering, it had to be technically feasible. And as I always say to clients and people taking classes, the best decision isn't necessarily the best technical decision, but it's the one that's going to actually get permitted and built.
And how well did that sell?
It took a while, but it sold beautifully, because I could demonstrate we had 120 stakeholder entities. And an entity would be the city of Phoenix, one out of 120. Tribes, this, that, Audubon, Sierra, on, 120, who did not think they could sit in the same room with each other. But guess what? They, on 14 grade, my biggest thing was first our technical team, getting them to sit down and figure that this was going to actually work. So, out of the 14 criteria, we had huge agreement on the importance of 9 of them. Relatively good agreement on 3, and hearty disagreement on 2. Not bad, see? And so the engineers went back and they redesigned alternatives. And the way we did the whole thing, the end result is something no one had thought of, with the collective wisdom. And we had a congressman named Mo Udall, because our congressional delegation was favoring the dam because they didn't want to lose the big water project. And Mo Udall said it was as plain as the nose on our face, but we just couldn't see it, about the ultimate solution. So that's always been my, in fact, I wrote up a 2-page story about it recently. Because I was with a bunch of women, we were riding our horses down what would have been the bottom of a reservoir on this Indian reservation had the dam been built. Nobody knows that now. It was 40 years ago.
Can I just bring it back to those sort of essence of the kind of things that were going on? I'm sort of interested in going back to sort of in the workplace what that was like, and working with people who were not necessarily so attuned to the engagement picture. I mean, what kind of stories did you tell them to convince them that this was something that they had to kind of put on the table? What did you use as scenarios, and how did you build up? I mean, I guess all of us use kind of, what we call war stories of, situations where it went wrong. But when you're in the start of it, how did you kind of tell people what was going on, or did they just know because things had happened?
Yeah, we all have our stories that we use to make different points, as we all in the training. Some of them are things that didn't work, or not that you tried it, but here was a disastrous situation, all because it didn't involve the public soon enough or properly, or they were checking off boxes or that sort of thing. And I think we all have those kind of stories. And then to show how sometimes I have examples where the whole thing went wrong, and that's when I get called in, as you know, to fix it. Well, I can't fix it unless we do some different way of thinking here.
I'd kind of like to go back to not so much history, but what was going on and get your view of it, Marty. I think what was going on in the 90s was it was no longer just consultants. That in fact, even though maybe the practice of public participation hadn't been totally institutionalized, the role of a practitioner within these agencies did begin to develop.
Yeah.
And so we were seeing more and more people show up at conferences, et cetera, that weren't consultants, but in fact worked for government and whose primary job within that agency was to do public participation.
Yeah.
And there was an expectation that they either had or would develop an expertise appropriate to playing that role. And they were looking for, how could they do that job well, but struggling within those agencies where they were perceived their role was to get projects approved.
Right.
And I think I was either the first or second conference I showed up with a code of ethics that I'd put together because all of these employees of these agencies, particularly at the federal level, were experiencing ethical dilemmas about what it was right to do and what was unethical to do in public participation. So I think that was kind of an important moment in IAP2, 3.2 growing up, as well as the practice growing up, was to say, this isn't just what works. There are values and there are ethics associated with what we do. In order to call ourselves practitioners, we need some of the trappings of practitioners and of people who know what they're doing and know what the right thing to do is. And so anyway, I'm curious about your reaction to that being kind of something that began to emerge that we as an organization needed to pay attention to.
I think so. No, you're right. And I remember that conference, and pulling people together and starting to talk about it. And we started with ethics and realized that needed the core values first in order to come back and really have the ethics. So then you switched over and grandfathered that as well. But I mean, it really, even though we had dropped a third T, we knew it was a practice that required a code of ethics in the practice to help. And it would also help us when the client or whatever just wanted PR, or they wanted to sell the answer, or they wanted to, they already knew what they wanted to do. They just wanted to check the boxes. No. And so that was very helpful, I think, to the practitioners, as well as those who were, sponsoring public involvement on a particular project.
Yeah. One of the things I think we were both seeing was other people out there at the time, in the training area, since IAP2 wasn't offering any training at the time in the 90s, whose brand of public participation basically boiled down to teaching people how to neutralize the opposition.
Right.
And I think that's when we really realized, wow, we need some values and some ethics. I mean, were you experienced? I mean, you were practicing at the time when a lot of those trainings were going on. And
what was that guy that informed consent thing? Remember that guy?
I do. I don't want to mention names.
Yeah, right. I don't either, but it was, boy, he had a sting going, didn't he? And, but that wasn't public involvement. That wasn't public involvement. And I know when we had that meeting of what are we going to call this organization, we came up with participation instead of involvement. But yeah, I do know that. And I know when we started thinking about the foundations course, really wanting to be very clear about what public participation is and is not.
Yeah, part of what I think has been the eternal dynamic of public participation has been who should make the decision and should experts. And there's still a lot of people that believe the best people to make the decisions are the experts. And I think some of those trainings that were out there were very appealing to engineers and scientists and project managers who already believed that they had the right answer and that there was very little that the public had to contribute to making a good decision. I think that's really where one of the other big foundations of the training came from was we said, we're going to declare you make better decisions when you involve the public. And that was not the normal assumption of most decision makers. They assumed it was something that would take more time and more money and was a necessary evil. And I think that's when we said, we've got to turn around the attitudes of the decision makers on the value
that this could bring.
And that it actually makes better decisions. That's why I love your story about the real answer you'd all said was
plain as the nose on your face. We just couldn't see it.
You know, Margaret, there's just one more thing I think it's worth going back to. And that is, a lot of people don't know that the core values were changed once. And that there was a core values renewal process that we went through some years after their adoption. And the biggest change that was made, and not a lot, but the biggest change I would say that was made was we inserted the word sustainable decisions. That word sustainable was new. And I think I loved when Marty was talking about the different spheres there and without us using the word sustainability, which had some negative connotations, basically, I think what we were trying to do in saying that you make better decisions is that you make more sustainable decisions when you include all of the pillars that are normally associated with that. And one of those being the social aspect of it. And so I actually think IAP2 has made a huge contribution to sustainability and sustainable thinking and sustainable decision-making by how we've structured, as opposed to neutralize the opposition, how we structured the process of making decisions, not just involving the public, but the basic core activity of making decisions. It's embedded in the foundations.
And that's why we were very clear, it's decision oriented.
Yeah.
In that, one of the three foundations, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.